guys, what's going on? Gold and Blue Dude here with you again. If you haven't already, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. This channel is home of at least one college football video every single day. And today I was thinking about the worst case scenarios for each Power 5 conference as far as them trying to get a team into the playoffs. And really, all these scenarios aren't all that crazy. They're all doable. First, we'll talk about the ACC. Honestly, I think the worst case scenario for the ACC has already happened. And that's Clemson not going undefeated or having more than one loss. That's already happened. So this is the worst case scenario remaining for the ACC. I think the worst case scenario for the ACC would be number one, Pitt takes another loss. That gives them 2 losses on the year, but they beat Wake Forest in the ACC championship. So you'd have an 11-2 Pitt ACC champ. So I'm going to say Pitt's 2 losses will be to Western Michigan, and I'll say at Syracuse, and a Wake Forest 12-1 runner-up. And that means Wake Forest's only loss will be to Pitt in the ACC championship. I think that would be the worst case scenario for the ACC. I don't think they're getting a team in either way, but that would be kind of the final nail in the coffin. Let's jump on over to the Big 12. Worst case scenario for the Big 12. First off, Oklahoma State loses at West Virginia. That gives them a second loss. That's important in this scenario. They go on to beat Oklahoma in Stillwater. That gives Oklahoma their first loss. Baylor loses to Texas. That gives them their second loss, which means Iowa State would play Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship, and Iowa State beats Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship. So we'd have an Iowa State who's 11-2 as Big 12 champs. Iowa State's 2 losses would be to Iowa and at Baylor. Oklahoma, who's also at 11-2, but they're the runner-up. Oklahoma's 2 losses would be at Oklahoma State and then to Iowa State in the Big 12 championship game. Then you'd have Oklahoma State in 3rd place, 10-2. Oklahoma State's 2 losses would be at Iowa State and at West Virginia. And Baylor in 4th place at 10-2. Baylor's 2 losses would be at Oklahoma State and then to Oklahoma. Now for the Pac-12, it's a little bit more simple because all their playoff hopes hinge on Oregon. So basically, the worst-case scenario for the Pac-12 is either Oregon grabs another loss in the regular season, they still win the Pac-12 championship, or a Pac-12 South team wins the Pac-12 championship. So you'd have an Oregon who's 11-2 as the Pac-12 champion, or you'd have an Oregon who's 11-2 that's the runner-up in the Pac-12. Oregon's 2 losses would be to Stanford and at Utah, or Stanford and whoever they play in the Pac-12 championship. Either way would be bad news for the Pac-12. Here's where things get a little bit more interesting and a lot more chaotic. Worst case scenario for the Big Ten. First thing, Michigan loses at Michigan State, but beats Ohio State at home. The second thing would be Michigan State beats Michigan, like I just talked about, at home, but then loses at Purdue and at Ohio State. So that would give them 2 losses. Iowa loses at Wisconsin, but beats Minnesota, which means they would go to the Big Ten championship, and then goes on to beat Michigan in the Big Ten championship. So you'd have an 11-2 Iowa, who's the Big Ten champ. Iowa's 2 losses would be to Purdue and at Wisconsin. And 11-2 Michigan, who's the runner-up in the Big Ten. Michigan's 2 losses would be at Michigan State and then to Iowa in the Big Ten championship game. A 10-2 Ohio State, who's the Big Ten East runner-up. Ohio State's 2 losses would be to Oregon and at Michigan. And a 10-2 Michigan State, who's 3rd place in the Big Ten East. Michigan State's 2 losses would be at Purdue and at Ohio State. Last but certainly not least, the SEC. First up, Auburn loses at Texas A&M, just to make it a little more chaotic, and that's definitely doable. But they beat Ole Miss and Alabama at home. Both of those very doable. Third, Texas A&M loses at Ole Miss, so that gives them their 3rd loss. They're out of contention for the SEC championship. And finally, Auburn beats Georgia in the SEC championship. So you'd have a 10-3 Auburn as SEC champion. Auburn's 3 losses would be to Penn State, Georgia, and at Texas A&M. A 12-1 Georgia, but as a runner-up. Georgia's only loss would be to Auburn in the SEC championship game. A 10-2 Alabama, who's the runner-up in the SEC West. Alabama's 2 losses would be at Texas A&M and at Auburn. A 10-2 Ole Miss, who's 3rd place in the SEC West. Ole Miss's 2 losses would be at Alabama and at Auburn. And a 9-3 Texas A&M, who's 4th place in the SEC West. Texas A&M's 3 losses would be at Arkansas, Mississippi State, and at Ole Miss. Now, when you really think about it, all these scenarios are doable. Now, all of them happening all at the same time? Yeah, not very likely. But any one of these scenarios, very doable. And really, the most unlikely scenario would be Georgia losing. That's it. The rest of these could actually happen. So no, I'm not expecting all this to happen, but I do think some of this will happen. So there's your worst case scenarios for each Power 5 conference moving forward. That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.